another bard's tale. This week will be the final Tibetan folktales before we move on to another culture. Though by the end of this tale you will have heard 3 stories, and if you have watched the collections before it is 9 in total, if you want to read more of them there are sources in the description below. I merely chose the ones I thought were best. Now, the final tales from Tibet will begin with the story of Dressup and the goddesses. Long ago, in a mysterious land where men lived and loved and wandered and died, lived a man named Dressup. He was all alone in the world. He had no kin, no wife, no children, and he was incredibly poor. He wandered about until one day he found his way up a mountain, till he found a tree. Dressup lay down here, grieving over his troubles until he fell asleep. Once asleep, a little girl was born in the village at the foot of the mountain. While Dressup slept soundly, he was completely unaware that within the wood of the trees of the mountain grove were many goddesses, whose duty it was to cast lots and foretell the future of newborn children. As the little girl was born, the goddesses stirred and began to do just that. They decided who she would marry, when she would marry, how long her life was, and when she would die. The goddess which dwelt in the tree Dressup slept under called the other goddesses to her tree, for she had a guest. The others came and began to forecast the girl's future. She would die middle-aged from eating the shoulder of a sheep, and the man who slept at the roots of this tree would be her husband. Beneath the tree, Dressup heard everything, because he slept lightly. He whispered under his breath how foolish this all was, and found the idea of him, a middle-aged man, to be the husband of a baby just born, absurd. Nevertheless, once he left the tree the next day, he sought out this child. He travelled far, all across the country, until he found the girl born on that day living in the village at the foot of the mountain. Dressup was certain it was her, and quietly slipped behind the side of the house. He picked up a small woodcutter's axe and waited. When the girl came around, he struck her and ran. Believing he had killed her, Dressup ran to a faraway country. But Dressup had not killed her, and the little girl grew to womanhood. Over time, the girl's parents died. Having nothing to stay for, she decided to travel. On her travels, she came to a city coincidentally, that Dressup had taken residence in. They met by chance, and fell instantly in love. All was well with the two lovers, till one day Dressup noticed a scar on her head. She told him it was because a man took an axe and tried to kill her in the village where she was born. When Dressup heard this, he suddenly understood he could not escape the future foretold by the goddesses of the mountain. He didn't tell her, and kept the knowledge of how she would die to himself. They became married and lived happily, but he was always cautious, never allowing her to eat the shoulder of mutton, and keeping it all for himself. She always wondered why he would not allow her to eat the shoulder. One day, when Dressup was out on business, she killed a sheep and ate the shoulder. She thought it was awfully good, and thought she understood why Dressup would never allow her any. Suddenly she became violently ill, and Dressup returned home to find her dead. Upon seeing her body, Dressup understood that one could never escape the fate foretold by the goddesses of the mountain. This tale is known as the Frugal Woman. In a mud village long ago, lost somewhere in the mountains of Tibet, a tiny stream of water flowed, perhaps from a magic cow's head, or a magic horse's head. This stream never went dry, and never stopped flowing, and it sustained the villagers who erected a village around it. This village was ruled by a chief referred to as the headman of the village. He resolved all the villagers' quarrels, punished offenders, and his word was law. He had a very handsome son, who was unmarried, but soon to be wed to the daughter of a prince of a slightly larger territory than theirs. Both sides agreed to this proposal, and so the prince, with 100 men and their musical instruments, singers, dancers, gifts for the family, milk money for the mother, and wonderful jewels as gifts for the bride, traveled to the mountains to reach the kingdom of the bride-to-be. The headman had a feast. and had them exchanging gifts for no less than 3 days till they made their journey back to the prince's kingdom with the now wife of the prince. Before she left, her mother followed her to the door and said, "Do not grieve because you are leaving home. In 1 month you can come back and visit us." Her father, big brother, and little sister said, "Don't be sorry, for now you are the wife of this big prince, and you will have plenty to eat and nice clothes to wear." And her mother also said, "You must keep as clean as if you were looking in a mirror all the time. You must be good to your own servants and kind to your husband's parents, and also be charitable and give to the poor. You mustn't say bad things, as that's silly as a billy goat trying to butt down a stone wall with its horns." They hoped these words would comfort her as she went away weeping. Now, the greater part of the caravan had gone on ahead, and the princess was left behind with a few of the maidservants. The forward part of the caravan stopped in a fine valley come nightfall, and prepared to camp for the night. When the princess and the maids finally caught up to them, the princess stated this was a bad place to camp, for if it should rain, all would be washed away. The caravaneers talked amongst themselves, whispering how unspeakable she was, how she came from a common home, and she thinks she can make them do as she likes. Grumbling a great deal, they packed up camp and moved away. No sooner had they set up the new camp than a torrential rain fell upon them, and just as the princess said, the previous campsite was washed away. The grumbling turned to gasps of amazement. "She is a prophetess, and knows all things," they said. The next day they continued the journey, and once there feasted again for 3 days. At the end of the feast, the few maidservants that had accompanied the princess were sent back to her father, and she gave them gifts, and thanks for their trouble. Now some of her husband's servants had heard the princess's mother give her advice before she left. They went to the prince to ask what he thought the words meant. He wasn't sure either. The next day the princess swept the house, combed her hair, and saw to it that everybody had food before she tended to her own meal. One day her husband finally asked her what her mother meant in her advice. The princess told him it meant that she wasn't to be greedy and eat good things all the time, but if she waited on others, she'd be hungry, and things would taste good anyway. And looking in the mirror meant she was to keep herself and her house clean so she would never be ashamed of it. One day, a large crane came from the sea, carrying a few heads of rice. But as he flew over the palace, he dropped a few of the grains, which the servants then gathered and took to the mistress of the house. She said they must be careful and plant these seeds, for they make a fine medicine for fevers. The grains were divided evenly amongst the different families, who each took them home and planted them. After a while, the king's wife fell deathly ill with a fever, and called for the aid of the chief headman of the surrounding villages and all the lamas he could muster. But they told him she needed rice from near the sea to get better. Searching through the villages, they finally came to the prince's wife, who said she had just the thing. The princess said she had grown enough for all sick people in the country. She sent some of the grains to the king's wife, who eventually became well. She sent the harvest to other sick folk across the land, and from this time she was worshipped, and people always went to her in times of trouble and great need. The final tale is called The Golden Squash. In a corner of the world, high up among the mountains, there lived 2 old men. They were very good friends, and each had a small garden patch they tended to. One of the men was good, and quite naturally so. He never found it hard to do good, for his heart was pure. He loved all animals and was happy in his little garden. But the other old man was not so pure, for in his heart he wanted only wealth. One day the good old man found a little crippled bird in his garden. He took it and tended to it, feeding it every day and healing it. When the bird was able to fly, the old man let him go. But the bird soon returned with a seed in its beak, which he placed in the palm of the old man. The bird told him if he would plant the seed and care for the plant, it would grow in the finest squash in the world should you tend to it well. The old man accepted the seed and the bird's advice, and planted it. After a long time of caring for the plant each day, a tremendously large squash grew on the vine. When winter came and the land was cold, the old man tried to pull the squash from the vine and take it inside, but it was so large that it took 5 men to carry it inside. The old man became excited to try the squash and began to peel away the outer skin, which was thin like paper. But as he cleaned the peeled squash, he found it to be made of solid gold. He was now a very rich old man, but he was kind and gave to the poor and aided all who were in need. His friend came to him one day and asked how he had gotten this incredible seed. The kind old man told the story of the bird he had cared for, and the other older man began to concoct a plan. He returned to his home, picked up his bow and arrow, went out to his garden, and shot the first bird he saw, breaking its leg. The old man picked up the bird and pretended to grieve over its hurt, and he cared for it the same way the kind old man had. And once it had fully recovered, it flew away. Sure enough, one day the bird returned and placed a seed in the palm of the old man, and gave to him the same advice as had been given to the kind old man before him. The old man planted the seed and took very good care of it, and eventually it sprouted and grew to enormous size. He called in a number of men to help him carry it inside before winter became too cold. The old man was delighted and was eager to be rich as the other man was. He could hardly contain himself as he picked up a knife to peel the squash. But no sooner had the knife pierced the skin of the squash, when it popped open and a fierce old man leapt out. He claimed he had been sent by the king of the lower regions to weigh him. He picked up the greedy old man and placed him on the scale he had carried with him. "You are far too light," he said, "and of no use at all." He took him off the scale and cut off his head. So much for the sin of covetousness.